Great, welcome everyone. We'll just wait a few minutes for some more people to join. If in the meantime you want to just put in the chat who you are and what your current role is, that would be great, just so we can start to get to know everyone. And I'll kick things off properly in a minute or so as the numbers increase. All right. Just a welcome from me while we're waiting. I'll just wait a minute or two for a couple more people to join. But while you're waiting, feel free to say who you are. Hi, Rosemary, in the chat, and what your current role is, and we'll then kick off in a minute or so. Okay, so I think we'll get started as we're a few minutes after 12. So a really warm welcome to everybody. This is the 6th in the series of the UKRI funded Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network Early Career Researcher Lunchtime Seminar. And absolutely delighted today that we're going to be thinking and talking about alternative careers outside of academia for early career researchers. And we've got a fantastic array of speakers today who've worked either in private or charitable or third sector organisations, and several of whom have moved between the university and those sectors more than once. So really excited to hear about what they've got to say. We're going to go through each of the 4 speakers in turn. Who'll speak for about 10 minutes. And then what we'll do at the end is get everyone to come back on screen and answer some questions from you guys in the audience. So what I'd love you to do as we're going through the talks is use the Q&A box in the bar at the bottom of your screen. If you've got questions as they occur to you, please do add them into the Q&A box. If you want to introduce yourself to other people on the call or ask any other types of questions about BAM or the session, please do put them in the chat. But for questions for the panel, if you can put them in the Q&A box, that would be super helpful. We're recording the session and only the speakers will be able to come on camera and speak. And we'll also make this available afterwards on the website. If you want to comment or tweet about what's happening, then do please use the hashtag BAM webinar and tag us at BAM, so BAM8M. Great, all right, so I think we'll kick off. And we're going to start with Dr. Eloise Crush, who I'm delighted to have with us today, and is a former PhD student of mine, so I'm very biased as well, and delighted on how well she's doing. And she's currently research director at the Positive Group. And I'm going to hand over to her to tell us a little bit about her journey and what it's like working in that sector. Thanks so much, Elle.
Lovely, thanks Helen, and hi everyone. So yes, my name's Elle. So I did my PhD at King's, working with Helen. So my PhD was focused on looking at protective factors for psychotic phenomena amongst individuals who were exposed to victimisation. And so prior to my PhD, I actually worked in banking and finance for around sort of 8-10 years. So I was also a management consultant. So I did my undergrad in psychology, and then I also always enjoyed maths and economics type topics. And then I ended up becoming a bit freaked out by the idea of going into clinical, because you needed a lot of like experience in more sort of practical areas of psychology than I had. And I sort of freaked out, thought I need a job. and applied for graduate programs in banking and finance originally. And then I stuck with that for about 10 years before deciding that actually I'd made a big mistake and I really missed psychology, and decided to apply for a PhD. So I did that at King's, and really enjoyed my PhD, really enjoyed sort of that pathway as a researcher. But I guess when I got towards the end of my PhD, I started to think about, did I want to stay and continue on the whole sort of postdoc route and fellowship route? A lot of my friends were applying for Wellcome Trust fellowships and different quite intimidating type fellowships. Or did I actually like the idea perhaps of moving outside of research, and perhaps transition into the private sector? And so because my PhD was quite focused on sort of protective factors for mental health and kind of resilience, I became really interested in that area. And I felt like it would be great to kind of see that come into life a little bit more. So I actually then left academia to join a company called The Positive Group, who work with organisations in order to improve the mental health and resilience of their people. And actually, at first, I thought that was going to be quite sort of simple work, sort of raising mental health awareness and doing a lot of like psychoeducational talks. So I was actually going to be in a position where I was presenting to people on resilience, on mental health, why it's important, and ways to try and improve your mental health. And working alongside a team of sort of multidisciplinary psychologists to do that. And actually organisations are really sophisticated actually in this space. So they do a lot around the well-being of their people. They're very much focused on not just trying to support sort of in a reactive way people's mental health, but also trying to be really proactive about that. So not just are people doing okay in their organisation, but actually can they get their people in a position where they feel really resilient and are kind of really thriving and flourishing at work. So essentially making your wellbeing policy and your culture a positive place to be. And ultimately that in itself is sort of beneficial to mental health. So what's great about what I'm doing now is kind of that I get to see this really like practical aspect of psychology coming to life in the workplace. So whilst in academia, I loved sort of contributing towards the research and going through that publication process. I wouldn't necessarily see what was happening off the back of that work being done. And where now what's great is we kind of go into organisations, we do this sort of psychoeducational talks. We also do training that could be cognitive or behavioural in nature, and we kind of do a lot of we use a lot of data as well. So we use research methods and surveys. We collect data in order to understand not only in an organisation how are people's mental health, but we also use that data to inform and target interventions. So we look to measure aspects of, say, the environment and culture. So is it a culture that's really connected and supportive, which is something that's very protective for mental health? Or perhaps there are aspects of culture which need improvement or reflection. And we kind of work with organisations in that advisory capacity. So that's what my sort of current role involves. And then I thought it'd be good to touch on kind of how this differs to working in a university and from my experience with my PhD and how it's similar. So I guess in terms of the similarities, I mean, the subject matter itself, so it's all very much about mental health. It's definitely forced me to have to be much more broad in my reading and thinking than my PhD, which was more narrowly focused. But the subject matter itself is very much the same. So I still feel like I am a psychologist, albeit outside of academia, which I don't know why. That was always one of my concerns. If I leave academia, so will I still feel like I'm really getting to practice kind of the great methods and everything that I'd learned. And then linked to that, I'm still doing research. So whilst my focus now isn't on looking to publish, we still do a lot of active research. So we're constantly looking to use the data in order to kind of not only understand the people within organisations better or the environments within organisations better to support mental health. We're always learning new things and running similar analyses and techniques that I'd run in academia as part of my PhD. And then finally, I do a lot of presenting and communicating to audiences still. So when we do, if I do a sort of a research study or collect data with an organisation, then I'll present that data back to the leadership or the senior management team within that organisation to help them understand how their people are and what's going on in their organisation. So I think all of those skills are very much transferable, which is great. And they're not necessarily things that I'd have thought that I'd have, I think there's probably more that was transferable than I expected. And actually the private sector and the team I worked in, I worked with a lot of really, I work with a lot of multidisciplinary psychologists. So I work with clinical psychologists, educational, health psychologists. But I think I was actually the first research psychologist to join the organisation. And actually it was great to see how much people valued that kind of data and research side of things, which was great. And then in terms of things that differed, so definitely the pace of work. So things move pretty fast in the private sector. I mean, things move fast in academia too, or the publication process, perhaps not so much. But I think you're always busy and got a lot to do in academia, but the speed of which things just need to be done feels a lot faster where I am now. And that's linked to the fact clients want things quickly and they want things within a week or 2 weeks. So something that I probably would have preferred to have spent maybe a month on researching, suddenly I need to get a survey created or measure something or get a report back within a couple of weeks. So linked to that, you just have to become, as I've had to become, slightly less kind of perfectionistic and just get comfortable with the idea this isn't being published and I just need to accept that this is good enough for its purposes. So it's still going to inform an intervention. It's still going to be more helpful than not having this data or information itself. So as an academic, there was definitely a mindset shift, just of being a little bit quicker to get things done. And then, so I've already mentioned like this point about being a bit less perfectionistic. And the focus just not being on publications so much anymore. So I'd say they're the main differences, because for me it was quite a, from a research perspective, there's been a lot of parallels. And then my top tips for sort of early career researchers or anyone looking to transition out of academia. I think for me, I've actually interviewed a lot of people recently who, because we've had some roles come up and we had a lot of academics apply. And I think the first thing is definitely this communication point, so how you communicate the relevance of what you do in academia to an organisation, but in terms of their product offering, or why are you going to be valuable to an organisation? Because I think when I joined the companies, definitely as well, you become very good in academia about talking about your research in quite a complex way sometimes. And even if it's, and that's because often what you're researching is quite complex. And there is sort of a style to academic talking. And I think sometimes perhaps I definitely received feedback that when I presented on my findings, sometimes I didn't actually simplify it enough so people really got it or got the importance of it. So actually just sort of making sure you communicate in a way that people really get the point, get why you're valuable and relevant to them and why your research is and your research methods. I think that's really important because I think, language, communication can be a real barrier otherwise. And you could be the best kept secret and your research might never really be appreciated. So I had some amazing academics applying for jobs and we found that sometimes you couldn't necessarily see the relevance of what they could do, sort of the relevance of their research to actually the company and the so what, and why the sort of outside world, how is this practically relevant to the outside world? That real life implications. And then linked to that, just be really confident and back yourself, because I think academia is a really tough environment with really bright people. So if you survive academia well and you are thriving there, then I think in the private sector you'll be great. And then lastly, just if you do apply to these types of well-being, mental health, resilience type companies, there's a lot of them out there, just really know your stuff and your research, because it can really come across if people don't necessarily understand like the organizational side of things, or sort of what's going on in the sort of post-pandemic world, or sort of references to, I guess, what's going on across an industry. So just making sure you've read those papers by McKinsey or some of the bigger companies like Gallup, so you can bring in some sort of real life sort of broader points and facts that these organizations will be operating in as well. And Helen's popped up, which means I'm out of time. So yeah, I hope that covered everything.
Thank you so much, Elle. That was fantastic and really, really interesting that you kind of were in, if you like, academia first, then went into private, and then went into academia, back into private. And there's a really interesting question already in the chat, which we'll come to at the end. But thank you so much. Just a reminder, everyone, do keep adding questions into the Q&A box as they occur to you. And we'll move on now to our second speaker, who is Dr. Min Zhang, who's Executive Director at Survivor Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us, Min.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I am going to share some slides, and hopefully I can send these over to Helen, and Helen can send them out if needed.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to say, while you're doing that, you go ahead and share. We'll be on the website, and we'll put the link in to the chat. We'll be providing this recording and slides and any of the additional materials that the speakers have suggested afterwards. So thanks so much.
Great.
So thanks so much, Min. Really great that you can join us, and I'll let you get on with your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I've titled this only because I was asked to give it a title, but so third sector is your sector. My accent is American, and you will hear some more context before I get into my current role. So I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, and my undergraduate work was at University of California, Berkeley. And then I worked at something we had called the Public Service Center. And that place was meant to connect academic work, university research to what we would call the community. So here's a photo of a map of the University of California, Berkeley. There's bits and pieces of the university elsewhere. It's an internationally recognized university. This is within a larger city called Berkeley. And here it's, I've handpicked this photo, so it seems like it's big, and it's also seen as a major part of the city. But actually politically, there's a tension, because the university brings so many jobs and is an important aspect, but there's, university students often don't engage in the larger city, or there have been youth who go to elementary or primary school in the city of Berkeley and have never visited the campus. And so there's a lot of conversations about how does a university be a part of the community. Here's a picture of the whole city of Berkeley, and I've put in this square how big the university is to the larger city. I put that in context because in my work before, there's a lot of conversations about what we considered the university community divide. I know in the UK, the third sector, it's referred to as the third sector or charity sector. In the US, it's more the nonprofit sector. Academia would relate to the nonprofit sector, the charity sector, as if that's the community out there. There's this, not just a divide, but a hierarchy. Another way to look at it could still be that there's a divide, but less of a hierarchy, and that there's more relationships between the two. The reason why my talk is the third sector is your sector is because universities' academic work is a part of a larger community. We can call it our local city community. We could call it our global community, right? And this is true in not just violence against women and mental health sector, but the concept of lived experience, of having PPI and public involvement really is trying to break down this barrier. And yes, there are still these separations, but I think it's important if you're going to work in the third sector is to see that there's a need for this divide to be broken, or to see where there's actual overlap. It's not black and white, but there's this gray area. As academics, we are members of the community. We are probably service recipients in some aspects. We may be having family members who receive support. We may have donated to the third sector. So these are not completely separate from us. And so I think one thing is to not get stuck in, well, I'm an academic and the third sector is some unknown thing. Yes, there's obviously a lot to learn. And yet I think that one of the ways that academics can do harm and maybe go in a bit arrogant is to say, well, I've got all this academic knowledge, which is better and more important. So be mindful of that. So my current work is, I actually hold a dual role. I am the executive director of Survivor Alliance. We work with survivors of modern slavery and human trafficking. Won't get into debates about the definition of that, but we don't provide direct service. We are focused on engaging survivors as lived experience experts, not to tell our trauma narrative, but to really focus on how do people with lived experience provide input into policy, practice, research. And I came to the UK to start a PhD at Nottingham and to launch this NGO that was supported by the University of Nottingham. So the formal collaboration with Nottingham is called INSPIRE, involving survivors in policy and intervention research. So I hold a research fellowship, so I'm not 100% outside of academia, because I actually don't want to have an either or. I've got one foot in, one foot out. It does mean that I basically have two jobs, but the whole idea is that if people with lived experience, of which I identify as a survivor of human trafficking, do not have access to knowledge production, to be people who are informing knowledge production, leading knowledge production, co-producing, then interventions and policies are going to be absent of that knowledge, especially because nowadays, government officials are reliant on academic research quite a bit to inform their policy. So I have an official role at the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab. I run a AHRC funded project on well-being for survivors of human trafficking. It was also my PhD that I finished last July. It was on how do survivors of modern slavery define well-being. So for me, there are a few things to take into moving forward. As I mentioned, you are already a part of the third sector. Do not go in and treat it as if there's actually shared interests between what I believe and where I come from. The University of California was a public institution funded by the public, and that's what the third sector is about: serving the public, serving the greater good. So actually there's shared goals. Secondly, you are more than your research skills. So I don't presume that people want to go into third sector just to do research, but even if you are, remember all those project management skills you had to learn, time management, team working skills, negotiating with your supervisor, funding applications. Those are also really important skills to share in the third sector when you are applying. Be mindful of the implicit savior complex that people often bring to, quote, charity work. I don't love that term charity because it seems like a handout. And what I mean by savior complex, in my field specifically, there's a lot of, oh, we need to save victims of human trafficking and rescue them. It's not just in this sector. We cannot see the people that we're serving in the third sector as people who need our saving. We are accompanying people. We're creating a better world and environment for people to thrive in. So that, I think, for better, well, no, I'll just say mostly for worse, academia can, again, with this divide, say we're researching on people. Similarly, charity and third sector can say we're giving help. We need to help these people who don't have enough in themselves. That's different from there's a need for access to resources, but that the people that are in the charity sector are not lesser than academics and community workers, or academics and if you work in the charity sector. This might seem odd for me to bring up because no one goes in with this idea consciously that we're better than, but it gets reinforced in paternalism. I see that quite a bit. And if we come in with the academic mindset, sometimes that gets perceived as paternalism of, well, we researched this, so this is better, rather than listening to the service users or participants in the program. And lastly, I'll just say, be clear with yourself and your employer about how much you want research to be a part of your job. There are absolutely roles in the third sector that are focused on research, and there are other roles that aren't, that you may be suited for, but you can say, I would like to include research in this element, or is there a future in this organization for me to do research? Or can I have time to still work on publishing my work? And so be very upfront about the fact that if you want to continue to write and publish your PhD, or have the academic part of you fed and fueled. I know that's a hard thing for ECRs, is how do you fit in all of this while also trying to work a full-time job? So I think, especially now with more flexible work schedules and whatnot, there may be some way that your organization could see the benefit of you also getting a chance to write and publish, etc., because those linkages actually might help the organization learn more, get connected to researchers that could support their work, etc. So Helen's now popped up, so that's also my time to pause and stop. So thank you so much, and I'll be here for the Q&A.
Thank you, and I feel like no one else can clap, so I'm going to give you a clap as well. Thank you, really fascinating, and I think also some really great kind of bigger picture stuff there too, about which I think is really important. So it's very quick for us to kind of focus on the detail of just moving into another sector, but as you say, some big issues there to really think about and tackle as well. Great, thank you so much. So just a reminder to everyone, please, as if that also prompted some thoughts and questions that you want us to come back to in the panel at the end, please do start putting them in the Q&A box, and we'll just lay them out for discussion later. Great, so we'll move on now to our third speaker, who's Dr. Dan Robleson, who's the Deputy Research Director at the McPin Foundation, but has held many different roles in and out of academia. And I'll pass over to you, Dan, to tell us about your adventure.
Thanks, Helen. Apologies about the lighting. I've got a bit of a problem with my overhead light, but we'll go with it. So thanks, Helen. Yes, I'm Dan Robleson. I work at an organisation called McPin Foundation, who I'll talk a little bit about later. But I wanted to talk through some of my career history to date, as previous speakers have done. So when I first left university, I went and got a job in the private sector, and I worked for an IT publishing company, and I didn't like it very much. I did it for a year, and I didn't like the culture very much. The kind of the bottom line being money all the time, basically. And so I knew I had to sort of go back, sort of leave at some point. So I did. I went back and did a master's, and then after that, found my way into various research roles. Moved down to London and found myself in various research roles, research assistance roles, which are, of course, limited fixed-term contract roles. One of them was long enough for me to do a part-time PhD. This was actually at UCL, part-time alongside my research assistant role. So I was able to collect data for my PhD at the same time as doing it for my job too, which I think gave me a bit of a distance from, I suppose, PhD student culture, because I was essentially coming into UCL as a member of staff and doing my PhD as part of that. But when I left that, or just before I finished my PhD, I moved into the charity sector, an organisation called the Mental Health Foundation. And the reason I wanted to do that, because I couldn't really see a role for myself in academia at the time. It wasn't really what I wanted to do. Didn't really want to pursue an academic career. But after 4 years, I ended up back in the academic circles, working at King's down at the IOPPN, Institute of Psychology, Psychiatry and Neuroscience, for another 4 years, working on their stakeholder involvement for their biomedical research centre. And the reason I went there was because it offered me a promotion opportunity, really. But after 4 years there, I then moved back into the charity sector, which of course was easier to, not much of a transition the second time, because I'd already done it. So I come from the perspective of someone who's jumped around a little bit in between sectors. So my current role is I'm Deputy Research Director at McPin. And as Min was saying, this is very much around lived experience, around embedding lived experiences of people with mental health difficulties into research work and evaluation work. So we work alongside academics, work alongside universities and other charities a lot, but it has that lived experience element to it. So my role is very much kind of project management, line management, team management, and sort of working with the sort of strategic direction of the organisation. In terms of how it differs from working in a university, well, there's a few differences, but I'd say one of which is that it's values-based. So we are, as a charity, we're accountable to our values and our charitable mission. We're not necessarily accountable, so we're not necessarily accountable to sort of a bottom line in the same way as the private sector. So that means when we work with academics, which we do quite a lot, we are often find ourselves kind of holding them accountable to our charitable mission. Sometimes that creates tension, and it's a good kind of tension, but it sometimes it creates an interesting dynamic, if you like. So we're accountable fundamentally to something different. I think, as Eloise was saying, there's the speed of which we work, and the way I would describe it, it's a bit like working in parallel rather than working in series. So when I was working in academia, it's very much one thing, next thing, or two things, next two things. Whereas in the charity sector, every time I've worked, and in the private sector, it's being thrown at things in different directions and having to catch them and spin them, a bit like plate spinning, if you like. So it's a bit more chaotic. It's a bit more kind of like trying to sort of keep up with things, and the turnaround is faster. There's also a bit more buzz. There's more emphasis on team working and organizational culture. So when you're working in an academic environment or university environment, you're often sometimes sort of in a room on your own or with one other person, or you're part of a small research group led by a professor, etc. So there's more emphasis on multidisciplinary teams in the true sense of the word. And which that then gives you a way of developing sort of skills and varied skills much faster. So you get to try your hand at different things, like comms, or being interviewed on the radio. Those kinds of things those opportunities are much easier to come by in a smaller charity organisation than a big kind of bureaucratic university organisation. The disadvantage is that there's often less opportunity for promotion. So that, when I described at the beginning that I've moved around, every time I've moved in and out of different sectors has been to take a promotion. So there isn't the kind of linear track available to you that there is, or that there appears to be in academia. But I think the reason, one of the reasons, this is quite topical, so one of the reasons that I have worked in the charity sector so much is it's probably worth mentioning that the only time I've ever had like a permanent job has been in either the private sector or the charity sector. And this is topical, of course, because of the strikes that are happening at the moment. And, you know, a lot of kind of jobs in academia, in the research jobs rather than the tenured jobs, are fixed term contracts. So I think for me, it's always been a good move. I always saw that as a route into a more kind of permanent job. And that's been my observation, is that they're easier to find outside of academia. So in terms of similarities between the sectors, I don't think there are that many in terms of the ways of working, but I do a lot of the same things. So we do bidding for grants. Not all charities, rely on donations, or even donations from the public being that big a part of their income. A lot of them do trust fundraising and charitable and grants fundraising to, the usual NIHR and other research funding bodies. So we work with academics a lot. We've worked with Helen, who's leading this seminar, for example, and we also get to publish in peer review articles and stuff. So I've noticed I've been on a lot more peer review articles since I've been at the PIN, but mainly more as a kind of like secondary author rather than being the first author. So I've been on more, but my authorship is sort of further down the list, if you like. And I'm fine with that. I mean, that's one of those things that you have to think about in terms of what you want for your career. So my top tips would be, firstly, I think laterally rather than literally. And I've noticed in academia, there's a tendency for PhD students to think very focused on an area of work and not think so much around the transferable skills, as the previous speakers have also talked about. Like, what are you doing when you're solving problems, when you're being resilient, etc., when you're presenting, when you're kind of organizing a project on your own, all of those kind of things, and communicating your research to the public, all of those things are more important than the actual technical research skills, which are still important too. I'd say think more about the bigger system of where your work fits in, and think about the values that you hold and how whether you're accountable to those values in the role that you currently sit in. So my big advice would be build those transferable skills and the technical skills. So things like Stata or SPSS, R, whatever you use, sort of running focus groups, etc. Those are really handy as well. Web development, anything that those kinds of technical skills are handy. A specialist subject knowledge is actually a bit less important, I would say, when I'm looking at CVs of people coming into the organisation or applying to be in the organisation. I'm probably more interested in kind of attitude and the value base as much as the sort of technical skills. So the other thing that I made sure that I did when I was in academia was get some line management experience. So if you can pick up some line management experience, and that will be very helpful, because that will allow you to then progress into sorts of management roles in the charity sector much easier than if you haven't. Again, I've talked about presentations and kind of knowledge of inside NHS systems, always pretty handy in so many jobs that I'm aware of. And think about the application, think about how your work applies to the so-called real world, whether that's the NHS or whatever else, because I think that's ultimately what matters. So, I think sometimes this gets lost a little bit in academia. There's with the goal being to publish and to secure new grants. So actually, those aren't really the goals. They're kind of like means to an end. The end itself is actually to change things or improve things, or to improve new knowledge. So I think more about that step rather than the process itself. So I think that would be what I would suggest people do, but check our organisation out if you can, at pin.org. I believe Helen's put it in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was really fantastic, and just really nice, I think, for people also to hear about that movement between sectors and what you've learned and managed to gain from those different experiences. And I think that real emphasis on that difference between the kind of values, and I think values should be important in academia, but I agree, I don't think that is where the emphasis normally ends up being. It becomes, I think, what the currency is in each sector is quite different. That's really important. Great, thank you so much. We'll move on to our final speaker. And just a reminder, do keep putting questions in the Q&A box for me as we're going along. And we'll open that up a bit later too. So our final speaker is Dr. Stephanie Smith. And again, really, really pleased that you could join us today. And she's a senior advisor now at the Centre for Evidence and Implementation, but has held a variety of roles and also had a range of other diversions off a career path at different points. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing about your journey and insights into working in the different sectors that you've been involved in. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helen. It's a real pleasure to be invited to speak today. I've so enjoyed the talk so far, and there's some fantastic questions that are coming through in the chat box, and look forward to getting to some of those once the talks are over and done with. So a bit about me. I've got a fairly varied background. I've worked in academia, I've worked in frontline healthcare, and also held a few roles in the voluntary sector as well. And I guess quite a lot of you, I started with a psychology degree and had ambitions to go into the more clinical route. I worked in the NHS for some time and kind of quickly realised the kind of competition that existed for those prized clinical psychology doctorate positions. And that's the point at which I decided to do some more postgrad training. And I came to the IOPPM where I met Helen and did my master's in psychiatric research there, and then also my PhD. And Helen was my wonderful supervisor, as well as Craig Morgan. And my PhD looked at the impact of adverse experiences on the onset of first episode psychosis, and in particular looking at the impact of violence and intrusive life events. And I had an absolute blast doing my postgrad training. I loved it so much, and so much so that it shifted what I wanted from a career, and I realized that it actually wasn't the clinical aspects that I thought I was interested in. It was more the research, and really kind of understanding the knotty issues around epidemiology and around kind of implementation of effective interventions. So after I did my PhD, I did a 3-year postdoc. I was a key player in setting up the REACH study, which is a longitudinal school-based cohort study of adolescent mental health, working across several schools in the South London area. It's a project which remains ongoing and has got an incredible kind of a public engagement component to it as well, and definitely one to look up if you haven't heard of it already. And I was coming to the end of my postdoc and, had a lot of thinking to do about what next steps would be, whether I would pursue the postdoc fellowship route or sort of follow a more teaching centered path. And I guess the big hurdle that I kept coming around was the question of stability. And I'll be honest with you guys, I was at a point in my life where I was thinking about starting a family, was thinking about having a more kind of stable place to live and having the opportunity to start saving some money to buy a property. And I think a permanent role in an academic setting just seemed such a long way off at that point. And yeah, it really did have a huge bearing on what I was going to do next. And I also thought about what really motivated me. What was I enjoying about my current academic position, and whether there was a way to do some of those things outside. And I quickly realised that I love the PPI elements, the public engagement elements. I really loved kind of making the research come to life and making it more relevant and kind of embedding it to be closer to the ground. So I got searching. I looked on traditional career websites like the jobs.ac.uk, where else, Guardian Jobs, and saw there was quite a lot of opportunities out there. I found one with the National Children's Bureau as a senior researcher, and that's where I moved to following my postgrad, and I remained there for 3 years before coming to the Centre for Evidence and Implementation, where I am now. And yeah, I guess the concerns that I had about the permanency and the stability, it kind of really helped to alleviate that. As Dan referenced in his last talk, it was the first time that I'd had a permanent position at that job, and I had the stability where I was able to start a family. I've got a 2-year-old daughter now, which has been a real joy to have, and also allowed me to think more seriously about where to base myself. But I did have concerns. I did think, would I miss the rigor of the science and the kind of methodological approach of academia? I was thinking I would miss the kind of personal development opportunities and amazing opportunities for training and for networking. And actually, those things have still been able to very much happen. So certainly at CEI, in my current role, we're a global team of ex-academics primarily. So many of us have got PhDs, and we work across London, Australia, and Singapore. And we work closely with national government, with policymakers, with academics, and program developers. And the approach is very rigorous. It's really high quality, and it feels in some ways very much like an academic setting. And in terms of the kind of scholarly environment, there's still that option. We still take part in conferences. We still have practice development workshops where we kind of pick apart an area of practice. And in terms of what I actually do day to day, there are 3 strands to the work. So I work on projects around evidence synthesis and bringing together the most effective evidence. I'm currently working on a series of rapid reviews, including one systematic review to understand place-based approaches to reducing youth violence. The other strand of work is implementation science, which is a fascinating area that I hadn't done much whilst in academia. So it's been really interesting to find more about that. And the project that I'm working on for implementation science strand is looking at how to scale up an existing effective intervention for improving literacy in disadvantaged pupils, and taking that to the next scale from a kind of regional intervention to something that can be offered more widely across the UK. And then the third strand of the 3 core aspects of CEI's work is the actual kind of pure research itself, so the evaluation and the impact studies. And I manage a very complex, large-scale RCT of youth mentoring, and looking at the impact of that on improving mental health outcomes and reducing violence. So yeah, in terms of the similarities then, I hope it's come through that I'm still very much doing that high quality science, and there's some really interesting topics to work on. But I did want to share that there is potentially less autonomy in this career. I'm often kind of responding to tenders from, say, Department for Education or a What Works Centre, which very much has their own strategic priorities and funder priorities built into that. There is less opportunity to perhaps do the more proactive work that you would do if you were putting in, say, your own fellowship or your own grant application. However, there is opportunity outside of academia to gain funding from, say, a UK Research Council if you work for, say, one of the larger organisations such as NatSem, or you can collaborate with an academic partner and receive funding that way. So it doesn't sort of automatically shut that door off. In terms of differences, so a big difference is that publication isn't essential to success, and that isn't kind of a metric that you are tasked with, but there is still a pressure, and this is something that I perhaps hadn't quite realized. There is still a pressure to produce. So although it's not a publication, the end product is still often peer reviewed. It still often goes through kind of multiple revisions, and the work happens. I think Eloise and Dan have both said this on a quicker pace. Our projects are perhaps tend to be 6 to 12 months long. So they wrap up more quickly than I found, certainly with my experience of academia. And you do have to get used to that kind of good enough feeling, which I still grapple with, and not having that time to really do a thorough job. In terms of other things that I've noticed, interestingly, I find the hierarchy in non-academic settings flatter and more inclusive. There are more, visibly, I found there are more women in the senior positions. There is more diversity in terms of ethnicity and race. And there isn't quite the same level of restrictions in terms of coming into that setting. So for instance, for my role, I didn't necessarily need to have a PhD to do a senior advisor role. The kind of experience and also lived experience was considered really important. And just to kind of benchmark where my role is with, say, an equivalent academic role, I would say it's probably equivalent pay and level of responsibility to a lecturer, senior lecturer level, which I'd like to think I would have been able to achieve had I stayed in academia. I'm about 6 years, I think, post PhD now, but I think the journey to get there would have been quite different if I'd stayed put. Now, coming on to advice and what I would like to share with you guys, I think really have a think about what motivates you. What are the aspects that you love in academia? What are the things that you find more challenging? And think whether those aspects that you really enjoy and that really kind of get you up and get you excited in the morning can be achieved outside of an academic setting. I think you'd also be surprised at how in demand you would be and how transferable your skills can be. There is a lot to take across, certainly complex project management, which many of you have done for your PhD training, is very highly regarded. Communications that no doubt you would have developed through teaching, presenting at conferences, the opportunity to collaborate across teams, and also your technical expertise will be very much welcomed. I would add to that in terms of a tip is, and I think Eloise also said this really nicely, think about how you can describe your research in a way that is kind of engaging for a wider variety of audiences. And when you say publish an article, follow that up with, say, a blog, a more layperson's blog, or a series of summaries on Twitter, to really start getting that out to a wider audience and getting yourself known. I think certainly when you apply for a job, that's probably something that recruiters will be doing, is having a look at Twitter profiles and any personal websites you have. So it'd be really key to start doing that if you haven't already. And really think about how you can situate your work in the wider context. So a lot of what I do is thinking about how to best bridge that research, policy and practice gap. So I certainly had to think a lot more widely than I did when I was just focused on a more kind of narrow set of research aims for my PhD. And then lastly, something that I would really encourage is to keep those links. If you are going to jump ship out of academia, keep those links to your university. You know, you never know when you might need them, and I think it's really important to keep those conversations alive, to perhaps consider honorary contracts. You know, think about how you can collaborate with past colleagues and students on bids, and yeah, keep that avenue flowing. And there, as Helen's popped up.
Oh, thank you so much, Stephanie. And a big clap to you and all of the speakers. I love the person that was able to clap through weird. So it was really, really big. Thank you so much. Really fascinating. And yeah, lots of different insights, and that really helpful, I think, also to hear, as you say, about what you've actually managed to do outside of academia that actually probably would have done something very similar inside, but with less job security probably at that point. Great. So what we'll do now is I'll get all four of the speakers, if they're happy to come on camera when they're able to. And I'll start fielding through some of the questions. I'm just going to change my speaker view so I can see everyone. Fabulous. I have a few myself, but I'm going to go to the Q&A box first. So just a reminder to everyone that's listening, please do keep adding stuff to the Q&A box if other things occur to you as we go through. So first one, I'm going to kind of open up, and for the people on the screen, if you just want to kind of wave at me, because there's not many of you, if you want to answer, or I might answer particular people, but feel free. So first one about worrying about if you want to get back in to academia, if you decide to return, are there concerns about that, or what would you say about that? I think, Dan, you covered some of that, but Elle, I don't know if you want to say anything particularly in relation to that. Or...
Yeah, it's a good question, and I've not tried, so I might not be concerned about it. Maybe I should, but I think if my gut feel is that if I continued in academia at the point I was at, I'd have probably continued along a sort of more narrow path in terms of my mindset of what I would have continued to do. So I think for me, actually having this break and step back, if I was to apply for a fellowship or something now, I can imagine that I would have a much more sort of motivated, driven and open-minded, sort of flexible approach to that. And I'd have really taken that step back around what does really interest me and what's triggered me from the outside world that could be relevant. So I think I'd probably write a more compelling fellowship now, assuming Helen, you'd still be involved in that in some way. but yeah, no, I feel like I'd probably write something more compelling and authentic now, having had that break. But in terms of applying for roles back in academia, I don't know. But for me, I've definitely achieved more sort of real life practical application to research now. So I would hope that would have strengthened my CV. But yeah, I'm not sure.
Maybe you wouldn't want to come back, right?
Yeah, it's not, and it has occurred to me that I would potentially in the future like to do 1 or 2 days, perhaps collaborating in academia, and then spending the rest of my time in the private sector. I think if you could ever make that work, that would be a lovely balance. Yeah.
That's good. Dan, did you want to add anything when you covered this a little bit?
I did talk about this, didn't I? Do I worry about being able to get back into academia? I'm not planning on returning, but I suppose I wouldn't ever rule it out completely. I think so. No, not really. But I think for me, I've kind of done it a few times. I think if I crossed the bridge again, it would just be a bit of a joke, really. Also, I think if I was to go back into academia, I'd probably go into something like student support, support, because I think actually that's similar to some of the roles that I am doing at the moment, rather than like an academic track, if you like. It would maybe working in universities, in the student support services, or sort of management role of student support services, I think would probably be a better fit for me than an academic track. And blending the two would be actually pretty good. I'd be up for that.
So on that note, I moved to Min. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say. I guess you are someone who is blending.
Yeah, I just put in the chat that I think it is part of the reason why I still have one foot in the door is because of that concern. I mean, I think, there's also studies around women. I too, want to continue to build family. And I think if you're an early career researcher in that stage, maintaining those linkages. So I think if you're formally out, I think others have talked about how do you stay engaged, just maintaining those relationships, even if it's turning up to a seminar, those are important things. And I think even if you don't have a role, your connections might be, someone mentioned that, Helen, you were their supervisor. If you had a project and you wanted to co-author something, those, I guess, ways of staying connected that aren't being on the tenure full professor track are helpful, just to kind of keep those relationships.
Just to say from the other side, we love those relationships, so please do keep in touch. I think increasingly in research, and we're very slow in the academic world to move into what is such an important space, but I do think the co-production of research with people with lived experience, but with the sector and private sector, is increasingly seen as important, as it should have done a long time ago. But I think there is a huge amount of opportunity for collaborations, and that's very strongly encouraged in academia, to collaborate with people outside of the university spectrum. So I think that's something, and as you say, another way of being involved without formally doing so. Great. There's another set of questions around pay and culture, and I wondered if any of you want to. Some of you have commented in response to the question in the Q&A box, so thank you for that. But I wonder if anyone wanted to comment on kind of pay or kind of. My thought is always that academic hours always seem ridiculously stretched, and if there are some advantages to culture in other sectors or not. If anyone wants to comment on that as well.
I can jump in here, Helen.
Yeah,
I think in my experience, the pay has been comparable, if not better, to academic settings. And I think if you're looking at the hours that you put in versus the pay that you get, I think the work-life balance, for me anyway, has been better outside of academia. We do tend to work, although it varies with deadlines and certain projects, we tend to work the traditional business hours. And I know in my team, we've made a call not to work post dinner time. And dinner time can sometimes happen quite late on some nights, but we try and cap that, and there certainly isn't the expectation to work weekends or holidays. That's kind of actively discouraged. So that's been a noticeable difference.
Certainly, huge issues in universities with pay and probably lack of benefits, as Dan highlighted earlier, which a lot of people are striking at the moment. Dan, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd add is that, there's sort of, I'll just give the example. So I think in terms of the hours, not so elongated, but maybe the intensity of those hours is more, so I think there's a bit of a trade-off there. I think the intensity of the communications that I have with people on a daily basis is definitely higher than it was when I was in academia, and that has its own, it's tiring, it's draining, etc. Whereas maybe the sort of long hours that sort of stretch a bit this way, a bit that way, that's not quite so much part of it.
Yeah, I'd say from my perspective, I work with banks and law firms and kind of quite, I don't know, for want of a better word, intense clients, pharma, that kind of thing. So it can be more of a mix, but I would say I definitely don't seem to work the hour. I think academia is probably one of the worst sectors I've ever known for working hours. So I feel like from a work-life balance perspective, I feel like it is better than academia. And from a pay perspective, in my sector, you're probably looking at a third more, if not double, to what postdoc salary ranges will pay, to put sort of a number on it, sort of at the lower range. So it is a significant difference, but then people will expect you to deliver if you're sort of client facing on that as well. Yeah.
Okay, great. There's a a question about are there things you actually miss? I think we've heard lots of things about the benefits of moving, and some of you have touched on this, but if anyone wants to say anything about what they miss about academia, if there is anything.
Elle, I think you might have unmuted yourself before me. Do you want to jump in, and then I can go afterwards?
Well, I was going to say I miss Helen.
Yes,
no, I think being part of a lab in academia, that's not something I have, and I think Stephanie, Dan, you might have different experiences of sort of working more as a group, but that's not something I work in. I always have a dangerous amount of autonomy, and I have limited ability in a smaller company to bounce things off of. I'm not like part of a lab, or I have to make a lot of quite difficult decisions on my own. So I definitely miss being part of a lab and a collaborative group. So that might be a really important thing to consider, whether you're comfortable doing that when you leave academia, especially if you join a smaller private company.
Cool. I would add that I miss the students. I got so much fulfillment from teaching and from supervising students, and you wouldn't get those same opportunities. I mean, there are ways that you can support upskilling staff. You can get involved. Certainly, if you come with a knowledge of a real technical area, you can get involved with in-house training and wider training. But it's not quite the same as kind of following someone's journey and supporting them through that process. So that's probably the main thing that I miss.
I mean, I would agree with what Stephanie says. The other thing I'd say is I miss things like honorary contracts and library access and that kind of stuff. You forget how, like when you're inside that system, you forget how it just kind of works for you. And as soon as you're on the outside and your honorary contract runs out, so what Stephanie said around get an honorary contract, do that. And, mine lasted about 2 years. I didn't use it much, but I used it enough. And then after that, it's like, oh, has anyone got access to this journal of something or other? Those sorts of questions have become very frequent. And often people in my team will also ask me similar questions that I don't have the access either. So you rely a lot more on kind of open access stuff as well. So I'd agree with what Stephanie says around students and teaching, although one of the advantages of keeping a foot in academia is that you sometimes and quite often get invited back to do guest lectures and things like that, which is, well, yeah, exactly. So on particular subjects and topics. So that's something that's quite nice when that happens.
I guess, I don't know if there's anything you want to add. I guess you're hopefully reaping the benefits of both. Are there reasons you think that's useful to have?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I do miss, just because I'm trying to do both, I don't have as much time to sit and read and think with this less purpose, it has to be very focused. And so there are times, especially in my PhD, I mean, that's a whole nother, I know that's very different from post-PhD life, but where you could go down the rabbit holes and start learning about other sectors and information. And so that is one thing that I think doesn't have as much space for. And then the other is, I think there's a way that conversations, even if heated, are really, they aren't as much about the reality of people's lives day to day. I mean, I think in violence against women mental health, of course it is and it should be. And yet, I'm dealing with safeguarding issues more often, or I'm dealing with, things that are more immediate. And sometimes it's nice to just not have that, because it like Dan said, adds a level of stress or kind of intensity to the data things that you're dealing with. So having to be more on top of your self-care, or have organizational practices to deal with vicarious trauma, those, while the third sector I think is more aware of, and academia should be, there's days where wish that all I was responsible for was like writing an article.
No, I think that makes a huge amount of sense. As you say, advantages and disadvantages of both sectors. And it sounds like you've got to deal with both. I have no idea how you fit them both in. There's a whole other set of questions about kind of how to get into these sectors, and several of you have covered points on that, but I wonder if anyone wants to add anything. You mentioned, Stephanie, briefly about places you'd looked for jobs, but I wonder if others, or you want to say a bit more about, you mean, how often there are jobs in these types of areas where they're advertised. You've all said a little bit about what you look for, but I don't know if anyone wants to add anything on that at all.
They're advertised in similar places. Actually, that's one of the things that makes it relatively easy. That's what, in my experience, the jobs.ac.uk adverts, you know, you will find them on there. Also in like the newspapers as well. The national newspapers, like the Guardian in particular, for charity stuff. But in terms of how you get into it, I think we've all said this. It's all about how you. It's all about. I remember. I think I was at UCL and I went to like one of these careers workshop things that they put on, and someone was saying, "Oh, think about transferable skills and what are transferable skills." And I was like, "Okay, right. So you can plot that onto that. So this isn't just technical knowledge of writing a PhD. It's like project management. It's, you know, you've got to think laterally about what, and not underestimate what you offer. People aren't in the company that you go and work for, and not really after your PhD. They're after what that brings, you know, what that shows, which is kind of self-determination, resilience, etc., etc., etc. And I mean, the line management point, I think, is important. I think if you can pick that up, it can be quite difficult to pick line management experience up in academic settings. But if you can kind of push for that, or supervision, or, you know, that kind of thing, that will help.
I'd say for my sector, it's definitely LinkedIn can be good for looking for jobs too. And then I was going to also mention cover letters are so important, because I think that an academic CV, that's where you bring it all to life in the cover letter about how your experience and these transferable skills that we've talked about will be hugely beneficial to this organisation, and they'd be mad not to hire you. So that's where it's really got to come out. And having recently reviewed some cover letters and CVs, I didn't actually realise how much importance I would put on that, because there's a lot of great academic CVs, but the people that have really thought about how that will be beneficial to the organisation and brought that to life in their cover letter, yeah, they're really, really important in terms of getting you through the door.
Yeah, and I echo all of that, Elle, and I would add about kind of being able to let go of your babies. So you won't be able to put in like a 10-page academic CV for a lot of these jobs. It will be a page, 2 pages at most. So things like your publication history will need to be culled, if not taken out completely. But you can use, as Elle said, the cover letter to showcase and highlight some important examples that are relevant to that organisation. But yeah, you won't have the space to share all of your accomplishments. So kind of being aware of that as a heads up is probably a good tip.
I can respond to some of the kind of related questions. I would, in terms of, I think a lot of third sector organizations that are smaller, if there is a research focused position, it might be the only one. I think maybe McPinn Foundation and others that are bigger will have more space for that. And so you'll, like as someone mentioned, you won't have a lab, but at least there are more people doing research. So I think in terms of like my organization, we would have to fundraise a lot of money to have another person who gets to do full-time research in our work. So I think for the organizations that have more of those, it might be foundations, policy, think tanks. I think even the civil service, there's like government research that isn't contracted out, but within government organizations. And I do see some independent researchers. It's not that common, and I don't know a lot about it, but some people, because they've built a name in the sector, can do some independent research. And that goes to the question of jobs without getting a PhD. I mean, I think lived experience research, there's a whole pathway there in terms of service research, but I will say that service users have also talked about the limitations of that being very pigeonholed, not being seen as academic enough. And so often to get research grants, you need that 3 letters, behind your name, the PhD. So I think weighing the pros and cons. And I think some NGOs, if you've been long enough and you've gotten good at maybe doing program evaluations and you've upskilled in some of those ways, you're not doing peer-reviewed research, but you're doing something that's more about data collection analysis that helps the organization. So I think in the third sector, there's quite a range of what might be conceptualized as research as well. There's RCT and peer-reviewed research, and then there's more about thoughtfully, methodically using data to benefit the work.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Thank you also picking up specific questions. Very useful. Yeah, I think it does seem like a range of experience is helpful, and certainly not a PhD required for everything. And as you say, differences for different organisations. I was thinking an organisation I worked with quite a while ago, which was NSPCC, had at one point a whole research department, and now it's become a kind of evaluation type department. But yeah, most of the people there wouldn't have had a PhD. Some of them would, but in those organisations often they have quite large teams. Great. Okay, I'm just having a little look at what we have not.
And I was going to also add a tip, not that anyone's necessarily asked about it specifically, but I think if you see some jobs you're interested in as well, and you apply and get to an interview point, use that interview as a process to kind of interview them back about, if you've got concerns about leaving academia, would you be in a supported group? Are there a load of other ex-academics that you're going to feel comfortable with, or you might be avoiding and want the opposite, or whatever? I think just you can use that interview process to find out about the company. I definitely sometimes feel like the candidates do come forward and they're sort of asking questions to figure out if they would be happy there. So you've got sort of nothing to lose just actually by going through the interview process and applying. If things pop up and you're not quite sure whether to leave academia or not, that might actually be really helpful to help come to a decision.
Thanks, Al. I think that's a really good point. And I think coming to sessions like this, hearing from people and talking to other people in those sectors, as well as going to interview and then getting that experience. I just wondered on the interview point, and I think it will differ quite a lot between sectors. I was thinking particularly in civil service jobs, often there's quite a lengthy kind of application process in terms of doing tests and various things. And I wondered for any of you within the sectors you worked in, what the kind of application interview process was like. Was it a covering letter and CV, or was it quite a long one? And did you just have a face-to-face interview, or did you have to do particular aptitude tests or other things?
I have done things in the past, yeah, and I think generally speaking, it's probably fair to say that it's a bit more multi-stage, than a academic environment, particularly for sort of research associate, research fellow, kind of non-tenured levels. Yeah, I think that's probably fair to say, although not. I think there are variations within it.
Yeah, I can speak to the variation. I think my current role, I put in a cover letter application form. I just had one interview, whereas previously at NSCB it was multi-stage, and there was I had to give a presentation. There was a kind of an aptitude test on qualitative skills and quantitative skills. So yeah, I've seen both sides of the coin there. But I think there's probably no harm in if you are thinking about that, preparing some slides that showcase your experience and kind of think about how it applies to that wider context. Having those up your sleeve, I think would be helpful. If you don't have to present them, to certainly talk about within the interview itself.
Yeah, I think the worst thing I've had to do is do an actual like an IQ type test. So I had to do not for the company, we don't do them at the company I'm at, but I've had to do like a matrix reasoning task, a verbal reasoning task, and something else. And they told me what percentile I was in, which yeah, was quite the experience. But I think that's quite extreme. What my company, we tend to do a cover letter, CV, first round interviews, second round interviews, and the second round involves some sort of presentation. Yeah.
I had to do one of those in the private sector. I was just thinking back, I'd forgotten about it. Yeah, one of those like weird sort of shape recognition kind of test type things. Yeah, I'd completely forgotten about it until you mentioned.
But I guess the other thing to say, as well as what you were saying earlier about and others about going for an interview and seeing what it's like and interviewing. The other thing, I guess, for those researchers on the call who are also still at a university, most universities will have a careers service and will have a lot of advice and expertise in different sectors. They do also use them and get some advice and do practice tests and all sorts of other interviewing skills and things in that space too. Just very quickly, one little thing, I'm just looking in the chat, and someone had asked a question earlier about, well, we're just finishing off this bit on how you get in. You've mentioned different places like jobs.ac.uk and Guardian and LinkedIn and stuff for finding jobs, but someone was asking also, are there particular keywords that you would look for? Anything particular?
I tend to, the one I use is charity. Yeah. I mean, it's really simple, but yeah, or health research, health policy, evaluation, things like that.
I was going to say nonprofit, not-for-profit. Even if you aren't kind of a monitoring and evaluation specialist, if you look for monitoring and evaluation, community-based participatory research, yeah. And if I could just tag on to the interviewing piece, as an interviewer, and when we hire at Survivor Alliance, come in with questions when they ask, do you have any questions for us? Always have something. It shows that you're actually interested. You've done your research. You've looked into the organization, read their website, like really get a sense for that organization, because that will be your chance to really have thought through, could I see myself here, right? And I think I really appreciate what Eloise has said, was you are interviewing them as well, right? So while you want a job, you don't want to get yourself in a situation where you didn't realize what you were getting into because you didn't ask the questions you needed to about the culture, about expectations, So I think especially now, if we are moving to this hybrid world, even around how often am I expected to go into the office, how do you build culture as a team if everyone's remote? Those things we can kind of forget about when we're focused on the job responsibilities themselves.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think that is always the thing, is that people always struggle to think, what is the question I should ask? But I think absolutely that is your opportunity, isn't it, to ask it? As I think, as you say, lots of things to think about going forwards. I'm conscious of time, and I think we've answered most of the questions. So I just wanted to quickly go around and see if anyone wants to add anything else before I bring it to a close. I don't know, Elle, was there anything else you wanted to add, or a very key message you want to reinforce before we close?
Yeah, so I think just ending on a positive, really, that the point around really having that confidence and backing yourself and just really communicating why they're lucky to have you, given you've been in academia, because I think academia is a huge strength on your CV. And and as I said, around the standards, the brightness of the people, sort of that ongoing intuitive curiosity, etc. So yeah, make sure you really bring that to life. And yeah, just check when you describe your research or what you do in academia, just check with several people that they all understand what you said and how, and make sure that some of that power is not lost in communication.
Min, do you want to add anything else when you've just spoken? But
I want to echo what Dan said about values, really highlight and echo the values that you share with the organization. And the other thought I had about sort of transferable skills was, at least in my world, theory of change is a catchphrase that's really about how does the organization see themselves creating that social change in the world. And you could maybe think about it as you had to think about how do your methods actually achieve, help you research what you're looking into, how do you actually achieve the impact you're hoping to have, so really thinking through all those steps about causal relationships or correlation. So those things relate in the third sector in terms of how does handing, I don't know, condoms out for sexual health, how does that actually improve sexual health? Thinking through those, the organization will have thought through it, and you may align with that, or you may have something to add to benefit them.
brilliant, thank you. Dan?
I just wanted to piggyback on that theory of change point, because theory of change is something you hear like literally almost every day, like in the charity sector, in the private sector as well. I've talked to people about it, and you never talk about it in academia. I've never heard the term ever come up in academia. It's weird. It's like some sort of divide, you can't mention it or something, or people don't know what it is, even though it's actually pretty simple. So I think, I definitely would agree that, getting your head around theory of change, and it isn't that technical, certainly compared to the things that people learn about in their PhD and stuff. It's fairly simple, but understanding that language is pretty important. Yeah.
I will say I have encountered it, but only because I'm working with an NGO. So, Stephanie, anything you want to add or finish?
I would kind of piggyback on both of those. I think kind of swatting up on the language and the kind of buzzwords that are used, theory of change, monitoring and evaluation. They often use surveys as a terminology, whereas we would probably say questionnaires or kind of assessment batteries. So being able to kind of drop that lingo into the interviews and show that you can be sort of part of that culture is key. And also picking up on what Elle said about the fact that you will be in high demand. I think as an academic, I think we're often plagued by imposter syndrome, which can kind of stay with us even, into really senior positions. But there is, you've got so many transferable skills that you can bring, and almost don't be afraid to see a step out of academia as a promotion. You don't necessarily have to go for, say, a research assistant equivalent position. Go for the senior positions, go for the director positions. This could be a really good opportunity for you to kind of jumpstart your career.
Fantastic. What a lovely note to end on. So just leaves me to say an absolutely massive thank you to all our wonderful speakers today. Really appreciate you giving up the time that you've been spending so beautifully improving the world, more than we certainly are in academia, I'm sure, but really, really appreciate all your honesty and really fascinating insights into the different sectors that you work in and the different paths that you've taken, and can see from the chat, if you're able to read it, that everyone really appreciates being here today and sharing that with us. So thank you so much. Do keep in touch. I'm sure me and a lot of other people on the call would love to collaborate with you going forwards. And thank you so much again. And just a reminder that session was recorded. It will be available. I put the link in the chat a couple of times on the Violence, Abuse and Mental Health network. You can also access the 5 previous sessions we had, one of which was actually about engaging with policy. We had someone talk in that who has been in university and now works in policy. So if you're interested in that sector, there's some useful stuff in that too. Great. So thank you all ever so much. Have a lovely rest of the day and stay safe. And we look forward to seeing you and working with you soon. All right, everyone, take care. Have a lovely
Thank you.
afternoon. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.